SGP. And we'll be recording the session just so people who can't join can view it after. I'm also joined on the call here by a number of SGP colleagues who are all volunteers who've given up their time to put on this event. So just a reminder, if you could mute yourself, just so we don't have too much background noise, that would be really helpful. So today we'll be discussing the challenges of using digital ID to access social protection for gender and sexual minorities. So before we dive into the session, SGP as an organisation wants to note that as we take part in another year of CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, we think it would be remiss not to mention the plight of women and girls in Palestine. So we want everyone to kind of acknowledge that these women and girls have been made invisible in the international community. They may not have been given the same weight as women who live with privilege in other parts of the world. And we'd like to ask you, as you participate in CSW and beyond, to push your governments, donors, your leaders, and our global institutions to actively and unapologetically stand with Palestine's women, girls, and LGBTQIA+ people. So feel free, as we said before, to share where you're joining from in the chat, and to add questions and comments as we go along. So without further ado, let's get started. So we'll be started by welcoming our presenters. So we have Brenda and Sahela. We'll then have a breakout session where you'll be able to discuss kind of concretely some actions to take in these areas. We'll have some time to feedback to the main session, and then we'll close. So we're joined here today by Brenda Lakshmi, who's a queer feminist researcher and advocacy professional, and also Hela Nazneen, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. And we want first just to give a quick recap of what social protection is. So social protection measures provide support to people who cannot earn income, or who face additional needs, for example, because of unemployment, parental responsibilities, sickness, disability, or old age. So social protection can take the form of emergency relief measures at points of crisis, work programs, or health measures such as vaccination programs. And digital identity schemes are increasingly being adopted to match citizens' data with their social protection entitlements. So this can mean the matching of and authentication of demographic data, but also increasingly biometric data. And today we want to question how the concept of gender is employed by actors who design and implement these systems, and what injustices these systems create for women, including gender and sexual minorities. So I'd like to welcome Brenda to the floor to give their presentation today.
Hi, Katie, can you help me with the slides? Right. Haley gave a brief introduction about digital identity-based schemes. So if you look at the Indian state specifically, the Indian state has been policing the bodies of gender minorities since the colonial era with laws like the Criminal Tribes Act. And this continues in the present day digital welfare state with its promise of social protection for all using a digital ID, right? And what do we mean by a digital welfare state? Here I'm going to use the definition given by Professor Philip Alston, UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Right? The digital welfare state is either already a reality or is emerging in many countries across the globe. In these states, systems of social protection and assistance are increasingly driven by digital data and technologies that are used to automate, predict, identify, surveil, detect, target, and punish. The forced digitization now of access to welfare has significantly shifted the understanding around identification. Accessing one's rights using a proof of identification. In the case of India, it's India's digital biometric-based digital ID, Aadhaar, has become synonymous with a person turning themselves into data and also being under the constant surveillance of the state, including disclosure of details related to their gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, among others. Next slide, please. Now, challenges with digitization of social protection. If you were to look at the data now here on the screen, for instance, as you can see, the gender data on internet access shows a great gender disparity in the between the urban and rural areas and general availability of technology for women in the country. And mind you, this data does not include any information on people who do not identify within the gender binary. It doesn't account for transgender and intersex persons. And also, it's very important to note that in many cases, especially in rural areas and in families with lower income, people are forced to share shared mobile devices, smartphone devices, because of lack of financial resources and with least amount of access available to women and transgender persons. Without any consideration of this kind of gender-based access gap to the internet in India, the push for a use of a biometric-based digital ID has continued in the name of inclusion, even during the global pandemic, further marginalizing the gender and sexual minority. So the mindset of the state, usually when it comes to women and other marginalized communities, is one of being protectionist, right? Which is equal to surveillance in the garb of protection, like let's set up a lot of CCTV cameras, introduce safety tracking apps, which collect a lot of data on women and trans people and other gender minorities, but it hasn't resulted in any concrete reduction in violence against women and other gender minorities. Next slide, please. Now, when we're talking about gender minorities, it's also important to understand how the state recognizes transgender persons in India for us to even look at the social protection system for them. So the Supreme Court of India for the first time passed the National Legal Services Authority of India versus Union of India verdict in 2014. And this verdict recognized the right of individuals to self-identify their gender as male, female, or transgender without any medical intervention. This verdict also included 9 directives to be implemented by the government of India, including introduction of an additional gender category, a third gender category on different application forms for the inclusion of those who identify beyond the binary. However, there was no standardized process introduced to change name and gender on identification documents. Individuals were expected to undertake a tedious offline process and were often subject to inhuman body checks by government officials. And there was also arbitrary demand for certificate of surgery, though the Supreme Court actually called it illegal. This resulted in individuals changing only specific identification documents that were easy to change. Let me give you an example. So there may be individuals living with multiple identities of marginalization. They may be Dalit, they may be living with a disability. And there are also other identification documents that are required, like your ration card, PAN card, which is for paying your taxes. Ration card is to actually access the public distribution system. So these are all many different kinds of identification documents that are available in India. So individuals then were forced to change documents as per when the need arises and when the situation is easy, right? Now, this is with the NALSA verdict. Now, in 2019, India enacted the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019, recognizing to protect the rights of transgender persons. And this, it's important to also note that this law, in spite of a lot of was included a lot of provisions, including a demanding surgery. This was set up to change the identification document, and people who wanted to identify to produce a medical certificate. Anyone who was okay with being identified as transgender had to go through only one step. And what also has happened is this whole process has been introduced as a digital process, right? There's been study done in the country to show that over 50% of trans people haven't even completed class 10. So they don't have the level of education or access to digital services or the internet, smart devices to actually complete this process online. And there continues to be arbitrary physical checks by government officials and doctors. And even although this process is online, the final the authority sort of approving the application form is still someone offline. And if this person is prejudiced towards transgender persons, then individuals are still forced to go to the government offices and engage with these officials, which means facing more discrimination again as well. So there's a replication of offline challenges even with an online process, and digitization has not solved the existing systemic change, right? Next slide, please. Now, accessing any state welfare requires Aadhaar, India's biometric-based digital ID, especially for those who are at the margins. They're dependent on the state. And to change your name and gender on ID documents requires an existing ID document in your given name and assigned gender. This is a problem for transgender persons because many of them run away from home and they don't actually have an identification document very often with them. So Aadhaar is required to change other valid ID documents, other ID documents, while other documents are required to actually change your Aadhaar. So there's interdependency of identity documents, and it becomes very complicated for not just only trans and intersex people. Intersex people, I'll tell you what the challenge with intersex people here particularly is. The Trans Act now within its definition has included intersex persons. Now, intersex people are people with sex characteristics, sex variations, or different from transgender persons. Not all intersex persons identify as being transgender. So essentially, it's problematic to club intersex people under the category of, under the umbrella of transgender. They're forced to identify as transgender in order to access any kind of social protection, including healthcare, which is very crucial for intersex people. And because of the forced identification, very often intersex persons, they forego their rights. So due to, and also the other important thing here about ID documents and in a digital welfare status, it's very important for individuals to exist as part of data systems. It does not guarantee access to welfare, but it is extremely crucial that individuals exist within databases even to become eligible for welfare. That does not guarantee welfare. So thus linking these different identification documents using Aadhaar continues to misrepresent transgender persons within different data systems, turning a systemic issue into a data problem to be solved. Because of the systemic discrimination, they can't enter the system, but then they can't access their welfare because of data and not because of the discrimination. The state doesn't acknowledge it. Due to the digital welfare state's heavy reliance on data, there's heightened need to prove one's identity, right? And as we've seen, transgender people struggle to enter different data systems. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there are many different kinds of social protection that may be available in a country. I am going to look at healthcare specifically in case of India and how a digital ID sort of creates challenges for gender and sexual minorities. Here I'm going to talk about not just only transgender persons, but the entire spectrum of cis women, non-binary people, trans women, and others, like everyone other than heterosexual cisgender man. So over the last decade, the understanding of bodily autonomy and agency has been steadily redefined to reinforce patriarchal values by the mandatory use of Aadhaar for different sexual and reproductive health and services. For instance, mothers cannot access, who do not produce their Aadhaar, their Aadhaar and their husband's Aadhaar, cannot access maternal benefits. And not all women may have their husband's Aadhaar for many reasons. They may be unmarried, they may be a widow, like divorced. So there are like many different reasons why a woman may not have the husband's Aadhaar. Accessing abortion services in the public healthcare system without an Aadhaar is not possible. Even with the amendments to the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, individuals do not have complete autonomy over their body and need to justify their abortion when they're going to actually like access the service. And this becomes a big challenge for single women. Mandatory use of Aadhaar for a life-affirming treatment like the antiretroviral therapy, HIV treatment, has resulted in individuals discontinuing their treatment, fearing the breach of their privacy. And there have been several instances, many different cases of Aadhaar data breach over the last so many years. Yeah, it's hard to keep count at this point of time. And also the government of India has issued a digital health ID at the time of administering the COVID vaccination to all individuals who used Aadhaar as their proof of identity. Some people didn't use Aadhaar, but for everyone else who used their Aadhaar, a digital health ID was issued to them and they were not aware of this. The Union Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has said that the health ID was generated after taking every individual's consent. However, individuals have, when you talk to them, they say that they had no information and nothing was provided to them. No one informed them about such a health ID being created for them. Now, the use of a digital ID to authenticate the use of public health services also tracks the individual's personal terms of engagement. And this is very crucial when it comes to gender and sexual minorities. You know, it tracks their personal terms of engagement with another consenting adult in order to access essential sexual and reproductive health services. Apart from tracking, the state thus ensure rights access only to individuals who adhere to its patriarchal rules, marriage, heteronormativity. This affects single women, cis women, and non-binary persons accessing abortion services and professional agency for female and transgender sex workers. Basically, like I said, everyone other than a heterosexual cisgender man. There is conscious ignorance or the erasure of the right to privacy for individuals from the gender and sexual minorities by virtue of just their gender and or their sexuality. The pre-digital power hierarchy in accessing one's rights based on gender, class, caste, religion, disability status, education, and all other discriminations is now being cemented with digitization. Such digitization and consequent digitalization without addressing the inherent systemic flaws leads to replication of offline challenges by digital systems. Individuals then continue to be excluded till this informational difference is resolved. The understanding of gender and the human body has been at the heart of the feminist struggles throughout history. The power dynamics challenged by feminist and queer movements are being reinforced now using a digital ID and technology under the garb of social protection. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brinda. And Brinda's shared some very interesting resources, which we'll also distribute with the presentation after this session. So I'd like now to invite Sahela to give their presentation on the situation in Bangladesh.
Thanks, Haley, and thanks, SGP, for asking me to be a part of this panel. I'll focus on Bangladesh, where the context is similar, but yet different. Haley, would you move to the next slide, please? And the next slide, please. So let's look at what is the context of Bangladesh like before we go on to talk about, well, how does the social protection schemes create categories that define gender in specific ways, and how does that affect the way we think about women as a category, but also sexual minorities, but also what does digital play in that, right, given the specific context that we're facing. So Bangladesh is a welfare state, of course, but at the same time, it has had a well-established social protection scheme And this is partly because poverty has been a big challenge for us since inception, where it has done quite well in terms of reducing absolute poverty, as you would look at. So we have about 120 different schemes. These schemes initially started with providing targeted relief, particularly because Bangladesh emerged after a very brutal war in 1971. But also we had a famine in 1974, and you needed these kind of targeted emergency relief. And specific groups are targeted for those who are considered to be vulnerable. So for example, lactating mothers, or schooling for benefits for particular children, so conditional cash transfers, pensions for the elderly, or there are particular employment reliefs when you have natural disasters striking you. So you can see how the state is thinking about how to reach the groups that state considers vulnerable. And since independence, as I said, different schemes have been set up. They have been set up partly to address vulnerability of different population, but they have also been set up, and you have to think about the larger political context, because none of the parties that came into power, or we also went through military dictatorships, ever rolled back these schemes. Why? Because these schemes tend to legitimize the power holders in particular ways, because you can always claim that we address the needs of the population in XYZ ways, right? So there's always that incentive to continue these particular schemes, which is not necessarily bad, but at the same time, it's sort of what do these schemes legitimize, and how do they categorize different people, right? These schemes, the way you access, it is based on national household database. And then you because you need to validate who is deserving and who's not, and monitor, right? But it also requires different kinds of documentations. Before digital IDs were introduced, which is the national ID in our case in 2008, and initially for voting, before that, but even now, given that not everyone has a national ID, is at the local level, you create lists. It's local level bureaucrats and elected officials who create lists based on household listing as to like which households deserve and who within that household, right? So how does gender feature within the scheme? And the fact that officials have power and you require particular kinds of processes and documents to access these national IDs, what are the gendered kind of barriers there? So could we go to the next slide, please, Haley? And Haley, I hope you're timing me. Next slide, please. So remember that schemes are created to legitimize rules, not just to address vulnerabilities of the population, because the state has different kinds of incentives. It's also about the state defines and labels you in particular ways. And these labelings, of course, continue from our colonial legacy, in the sense that colonial states had particular deserving categories, and we have continued with those. So you can see within these schemes, women as mothers play a big role here in terms of women are seen as conduits for, you target women because women won't run away with the money as men would, or they care about the children. Or you target women in specific ways because they're economically vulnerable and helpless, so they need to be helped. Not that these are not important aspects to address, but remember that these categories don't necessarily establish women as citizens who have claim over welfare because they are facing particular difficult aspects in life and grappling with it, or they face gender discrimination because of the social role that they play. Sex identity, obviously, in these schemes are important, and that identity is binary. You're either a man or a woman. In Bangladesh, since 2014, there was a cabinet directive which then allows people to identify as third gender. Again, and Brinda had laid it out very well in terms of what do these categories mean. For third gender, this is basically for the Hijra community to identify as neither male or nor female. So in a sense, while in English we talk about the term transgender, and that's how the discussion has panned out, Hijra doesn't necessarily cover all the aspects of gender non-binary persons that we talk about, right? And it also creates a confusion in terms of, are we talking about intersex persons or are we talking about transgender group? But it's also about whether you feel comfortable declaring yourself as third gender, and also data safety and security concerns as we raise it. And then does it cover the choice of people who don't want to be identified as third gender, but as another non-binary identity? So those points are already coming up in terms of the categories that you have and the space within which, how you can define your gender or what the state recognizes, right? But it also links to wider discussions in terms of who's included, who's excluded, but also around how you think about citizenship and other governance challenges. Haley, can we go to the next slide, please? So barriers in terms of accessing or being included in terms of, do you have an ID and can you access the schemes? There are quite a few. There are different types of social protection schemes, and each schemes target people in different ways, and what you require for that is different. So for example, conditional cash transfers can be quite different from when you need emergency relief, and that is universal, right? When it's universal, everyone's targeted. That's different. There may be other types of access challenges in terms of universal, like if it's you require a mobile bank account to receive that, then it's about who has access to the mobile. And we already heard from Brinda that not a lot of women do have that kind of access, right? Lists become important here. And lists here for a lot of the schemes is based on national household data, right? Not necessarily the national ID list, but even national ID lists are connected to the household data in a sense that they will ask you whether you have that national ID. And the data set, as we realized when pandemic hit, and there's been a lot of debate about this national household data and rectifying it, is not complete. And there are lots of gaps in terms of which household is listed and which household isn't. And that creates as you go, and sort of census happens every few years, as we know. So to complete the list when emergency is hitting, like the pandemic, you rely on the local level. So the local level board commissioner, who's the local elected official, and local level bureaucrats, right? And they provide you with documents or certification that you live in that area. You are one of the members of that local community. So they provide certificates, right? You require maybe birth certificates to get your national ID. So this is where then governance challenges come, and which becomes important, and it's important to talk about when we talk about digitalization, not just surveillance, but the other aspects of governance. This is where intermediaries become important, right? So when you need a birth certificate, obviously for a lot of people in Bangladesh, where you don't know how to read and write, and not necessarily your birth took place at a hospital, so you were issued with a birth certificate, you would need somebody to identify that you are a person living in that area, right? This is where the local intermediaries, as we call them in the governance literature, become important, because they mediate your access, they vouch for you, they help you through the different networks and channel that you need to get official documents. That the political gauges become important. Which parties do you belong to? Do you belong to the ruling party? Do you support the ruling party? Vote for them? Or do you vote for the opposition? And if you don't have those kind of networks and linkages, it becomes difficult. The other kind of actors that become important is at the local level, the shops and people who operate, when it's digital ID, those services, because you need to go to them. You need to operate complicated systems to apply for these, for the documents. You need to upload stuff. So, so the digital inequality here in terms of who has access and how you pay off the intermediary becomes important. But this is also what it means is your data is going to different kinds of people, and privacy issues and data protection issues are vital. And it is vital in a context where the state has a lot of surveillance capacity, in a sense that we have passed a Digital Security Act, and state surveils, and the act talks about anti-nationalist sentiments and all of that, but it can come down on you quite severely, and anti-nationalist activities can be interpreted in many different ways, right? So you're trying to access social protection, but you might get into all sorts of other jeopardy. Could I have the next slide, please, Haley? So there are, as I'm trying to point out, formal exclusions in terms of which gender identity is counted, as we heard. We also see that you have to navigate to get these IDs, and the kinds of, you may have to pay bribes, you may have to face harassment. And what does it mean for sexual minorities who are already marginalized? What we have data on, and I've shared the link, is both a program which is around, looks at the social and political impact of the pandemic, and it exposes the difficulties and the exclusion that transgender groups and other sexual minorities face, particularly those who are in vulnerable professions, to access social protection services. And of course, intersections matter, which Brinda outlined in her presentation. So Bangladesh Social Protection Scheme, of course, talks about the elites. It recognizes disabled persons, it recognizes elderly. But there are issues in terms of, are you a resident of an urban settlement, informal settlement? So, and what does that mean in terms of, do you have a residential address, or in terms of class and who accesses, gender, of course. So if you're sexual minority with those kind of intersections, you are even more vulnerable, and those things need to be taken into account as you think about access issues, but also who is excluded and who counts as a citizen. As we create these, think that digitalization is a panacea that's going to solve all the governance problems and access issues, and all people will be included. The next slide, please, Haley. So this is the resource that I was talking about. You'll find lots of different papers, but there are also other papers. If you're interested, please do get in touch, because backlash issues are closely connected to poverty, as we know, and social protection has come up in a big way in the way state deals with and disciplines people, right? And we have research on that, on other programs on backlash. So I will stop there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Sahela. And I'd like to open the floor just for a few minutes if people have immediate follow-up questions or any comments on the presentation so far. I've seen a couple of comments in the chat, but also feel free to unmute yourself if you have some specific questions for the speakers.
Hi, thanks, Haley. Thanks, Sohela, and thanks, Brinda, for sharing this insightful presentation and opening our eyes to the struggles of the people who, the gender and sexual minorities. I could resonate a lot with, I mean, even though I identify as a woman and not as a gender or sexual minority, but a lot of these experiences were quite relatable. Having connections with local political party workers or elected representative, or like having some kind of entry point, actually augments the whole process of accessing some social welfare scheme, or getting some kind of document, like you write a letter, get it signed by the elected representative, and then it helps you actually then apply for a official government ID. And if and there are layers of discrimination in addition to what has been shared. Like, what if you are a migrant? Like, if I'm in Bengal and I have come from other state and I've migrated here, say 10 years back, and still I don't speak the language, it adds additional layer of harassment and discrimination. So if I speak Bengali, I know that I won't find it so difficult to navigate my path. But what if I don't speak Bengali? What if I don't speak Tamil? If I was a migrant in the state and I'm trying to access some scheme that I've been here, my family has been here. So, in addition to education and class and caste, I think language also poses another barrier, especially for migrant families. So, yeah, I could just relate in a lot of places with your presentation. So, thanks a lot. Just wanted to share that.
Specifically on language, right? Especially when you're talking about technology-based welfare administration, because of the large population in developing country contexts, they're not educated, so they cannot actually access technology, because technology inherently is built for English speakers by English speakers, and it's appropriated by others in the world who speak other languages and use technology. So inherently it's another layer of challenge when you're talking about language. Technology and language is also another challenge for people at the margins. So thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you. Any reflections now before we move on to the breakout rooms? Any burning questions for the speakers? No, in that case, we will move on to the breakout discussions. So we'd just like to highlight that the purpose of this is for you to maybe compare and contrast your national or regional experiences with the experiences shown in India and Bangladesh. And the purpose is to create an advocacy tool. So we'd like to have comments and suggestions on challenges in your national context and proposed solutions for us and members of the SGP Advisory Board and Secretariat to then take to other international fora where these issues on digitalization and social protection are discussed. So to guide your discussion.
So in our breakout room, we discussed, we had a more broader discussion. We discussed the case of UK, where the Conservative Party has been using an anti-LGBTI rhetoric to distinguish themselves from the Liberal Party. I think within the case of UK, we also discussed how the social protection systems they become a way to exclude people, in the sense that they determine who deserves income support, what kind of women or what kind of motherhood is valued. Single women in particular are marginalized within this context. People who there is an expectation to be income producing in order to be deserving of benefits. I think some of the other things that we discussed were, so within Bangladesh, we discussed the challenges of just having so much stigma around gender diverse identities, a lot of hate speech, which has basically made it difficult for these identities to be recognized within the social protection system and the public policy in the first place. I think except for Hijra identity, there is no formal recognition of other identities, which excludes them from benefits at all. We discussed the case of India a little bit, how there is a difference between the approaches taken by the northern and the southern states, how cultural acceptance of gender diverse identities in the southern India has made it, supported their inclusion in public policy and social protection schemes. Whereas in the northern part, there have been examples of some segregation kind of schemes where there are dedicated schools or very dedicated schemes for transgender people, but in a way that kind of does not encourage their integration in the supposed mainstream. So these were some of the points we touched upon.
Thank you, Aparna. And then let me pass over to Wisal. I believe you were taking notes for one session. Maybe if you can highlight the top 3 points just due to time, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. In our breakout room, we discussed like different examples of different countries from different like continents. And before like diving into like the examples, we discussed also how like the digitalization of like the data doesn't include like it excludes the poor, and it even like reinforces like the capitalistic system that we live in. And like, for example, like there is like the whole discussion in the global north about the face recognition for trans people, but in the global south, like we spoke about like the example in India, how like trans people, like it's the least it's the least of their concern, the face recognition. They have IG and they have like a different system that they go through. And yeah. And then for the examples, we spoke about like the example of like Argentina for the IGs, like how Argentina has been like very progressive in terms of like the Latin America part, and for its like different countries, like they have like for the 10-15 years, they have been advancing on gender identities. Like for the IG, it could say like female, male, or X, like X stands for other. And then with like, and this has impacted like its neighboring countries, the smaller countries, like Panama. And then, like with the new government, they are trying to take down all these like rights that they have been working on, like Argentina have worked on. And then like there is a high risk that it can be dismantled. And also we've spoken about like the example like in India, Assam, how they are trying to build like trans bathrooms, and the whole like debate over bathrooms like for genders, like it's gendered the bathroom. And these are like the main points that we've tackled. Thank you.
Thank you, Wisal. And I'll pass over to, I believe it was Salome who's taking notes, but please correct me if that's right.
Yeah, it was me. So in our breakout room, we covered quite a bit of geography. With Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Bangladesh, Italy, Kenya, Nigeria. Some things that were common about all these places and people sharing experiences from these places was how socio-cultural perceptions of gender and gender roles play a huge part in how these social protection measures came into being, or they were disseminated or monitored or understood, and even implemented. So for instance, especially with cisgender women, because it's understood as their relationship or their identity is understood by the state only in relation with men. So whether it's father, daughter, or husband, wife, having an identity of your own and then accessing social protection through using those identity documents is often a challenge. And this is even before it became a digital ID. So even just the regular IDs, accessing them have been a problem. And the members of the group shared lived experience as well as other examples of how this was difficult. And in terms of actually accessing these documents, there's also a level of scrutiny because it's understood that people may use the social protection measures for other purposes. So you may receive a pension, but you may not really use it for the purpose that it was given to you. And so when we try to monitor individuals on how they actually use these social protection measures, is it making them more vulnerable then, and also putting them in particular boxes, and ultimately violating their rights in doing so. With that, we also kind of zoomed out into the introduction of digitalization within, the creation of ID documents, and how there's a huge political economy behind this digitalization process. And we need to examine what really are the motivations for the different stakeholders, especially tech players in the market and the governments, to introduce digitalization in a world where even if there's increased access, digital literacy is not, at par with the increase. So yeah, that these are some things that we discussed.
Excellent, thank you. Was there a final breakout room that I missed? If there was another note taker? No? Okay, excellent. So then I'd like to just quickly invite Brinda and Sahela if you have any closing reflections. Yeah, anything to summarize our discussions today.
Sahela, would you like to go first?
I was going to ask the same question, but I'm happy to go first. I think basically the issue requires further, of course, as a researcher, I'm going to say further examination, but it is a complex issue, right? It's not straightforward when you say, oh, well, this is about access to social protection, because this is partly, it's just an entry point into different forms of politics. There's the politics of why state categorizes and why it provides social protection. But on top of that, then digitalization agenda is being introduced into existing power hierarchies that's already there. And then sort of this, I mean, at least in the Bangladesh context, this drumming up of that digitalization will solve a lot of problems around informalities that exist or exclusions that exist is not necessarily the case. We all know that's not the case, but at the same time, how does it then, this agenda keeps on being pushed in specific ways, and we know that there are additional layers of problems in the way that digitalization would be used to surveil people. So we are, while we want people to have freedom and rights, and of course to solve the problems that exist around exclusion, but at the same time, that we need to sort of think into account what are the other complexities and what are the motivation of different actors for doing certain things, and what does it mean in this very complicated time that we have in the post-pandemic period, because let's not forget that poverty is increasing, and 1 in every 10 women will live in extreme poverty in the next 5 years, not to mention the sexual minorities and the vulnerabilities that we are going to face. And we are not going to get rid of the push for needing more documentation. That is already there to stay. So how do we fight this politics that's happening? And what are our tools? What are the narratives? What are the ways we not just share our experiences that we have been doing, but what are the best practices here where that allows you to push back against the exclusions and discriminations that we have been seeing? That would be my main sort of plea to people who are part of this panel. And in the chat box, my colleague has put links to the Ideas Bulletin that has come out, which is on anti-gender backlash, and some of the reflections from some of the countries on digitalization would be relevant for that. And it's open access, so feel free to access and also to get in touch. And thank you again so much for asking me to be a part of this panel.
India is essentially, is your blueprint on how to go wrong with the digital ID, and how to, all the mistakes have already been made. And instead of actually learning from these mistakes, countries have, like, this whole narrative has been built around Aadhaar and how it's solving poverty and bridging gap, when people have been written off the system. Lakhs of people have been written off the system as in the name of deduplication, in the name of fraudulent data. And these are poor people, right? People who absolutely, this is independent of gender, sexuality, any of that. This is about, and I again quote Dr. Usha Ramanathan when I say this is criminalizing poverty, demanding an ID document, and without it, instead of human rights, you're going to demand ID documents, especially when it comes to gender minority, based on your gender identity. then. You're basically placing people in a certain hierarchy of gender and deciding who is eligible to be part of the system to access human rights. That's what essentially it comes down to. And more and more, the more the data is mined for, I don't know, business corporatization, the more people are going to be dropped off the system based on their purchasing power. The poorer you are, you get dropped off very easily. And the people we're talking about, gender sexual minorities with multiple identities of marginalization, they're probably the first people to fall through the gap actually of the system, because they don't matter. They don't have the money and they don't have whatever. So it's so much more important at this point of time to actually strengthen social protection as a concept and system, all the more to protect the people at the margins. Instead, the states, many states in the world, not just the ones we discussed here presented today, using social protection as a tool to actually leave people behind. And that is something that needs to be looked at very, very seriously. How can we actually use social protection for what it was really intended? And as it came up in our conversation, right, it's actually useful to go back to the community and understand how, when I say community, communities of all kinds at the margins, at the grassroots, to understand how they're subverting the system to survive it, because they are the people who will then come back to us with the solutions about how to rethink, reimagine the system, because they're already doing it. So it is so important for us here, sitting in Zoom rooms, to actually engage with them more and bring their lived realities back here and to other places possibly, so that we can actually drive home some change. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brinda. And so we'd like now to close the session with that kind of rallying call, if everyone in their work going forward, both at CSW and in other fora that you might be a part of, can consider some of the challenges we've discussed today, and some of the solutions that we'll also hopefully shape in some follow-up sessions, and with the advocacy tool that we'll create based on today. So thank you all for joining. We'd like to also invite you to, if you're not already a member of SGP, to sign up. You'll be it'll be great for you to sign up to the newsletter so you can hear about events like this going forward. And I'd like to offer a round of applause for our speakers, Sahela and Brinda, and to all the volunteers who helped today. Perfect. So I hope you all have a very good rest of the day, and that you enjoy the rest of CSW, and we'll see you again shortly for another SGP event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Aparna, can you stop the recording?